Welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. In this series, we dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to our guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join us in real time by sending us your comments, questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepointwithalex@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. We air Headline Buster on Fridays at 11 a.m. Beijing time, so do get in touch and we just might read out your comments. Now today, we're looking at media coverage of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. What was emphasized, what was not, and why did it matter? Especially when it comes to the heartbreaking news of Afghan civilian casualties to U.S. anti-terror operations. As the last U.S. soldier left the Kabul airport on August the 30th, the Taliban held a parade to celebrate the U.S. withdrawal and their return to power after 20 years. But the U.S. withdrawal has been messy, to say the least. In the middle of U.S. efforts to evacuate American citizens and Afghans wanting to leave, over 180 people were killed in suicide bombing attacks and ensuing chaos on August the 26th around the Kabul airport. Among the casualties were 170 Afghans and more, and 13 U.S. members of its military. Now, ISIS-K, the Afghan branch of the terrorist group Islamic State, claimed responsibility. However, witnesses have said some of the Afghan casualties were actually caused by bullets fired by foreign forces on site, including U.S. soldiers. It's not immediately clear how many were killed and wounded by such shootings, and I'll come back to this in a moment. Now, for the United States, the loss of 13 service members was a moment of great shock and sadness. U.S. President Joe Biden vowed to retaliate in a nationwide address on the attack. "We will hunt you down," he said to the perpetrators, "and make you pay." He also attended a dignified transfer of the bodies of the fallen soldiers who have been hailed as heroes. 3 days later, the U.S. launched a drone strike at a target near Kabul airport, which they said destroyed a car loaded with explosives and suicide bombers heading for the airport. But tragically, the strike apparently hit the wrong target, killing 10 members of a local family, including 6 to 7 children. Now, the U.S. also launched airstrikes in Afghanistan's eastern province of Nangarhar, targeting an ISIS-K planner. Local residents told CGTN of civilian casualties, including 1 injured child. A U.S. military statement declared no reports of civilian casualties in the operation. In response to the civilian casualties as a result of the latest operations, the Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said the U.S. works hard to avoid them and that the U.S. is investigating. But given the U.S.'s 20-year track record in Afghanistan, it's hard to take such statements very seriously. Now, according to figures from the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, or UNAMA, over 110,000 civilians have been wounded or killed over the past decade. The number is staggering. So how have the media covered this, both after the bombings at the airport and after the drone strikes days later? As I mentioned just now, some civilian casualties in the Kabul airport suicide bombings may have come from gunfire by U.S. forces. This may come as a surprise to those who get their information exclusively from U.S. media. Did such shootings take place? Well, our reporter actually went to a local hospital and talked to several wounded. They spoke of being wounded as a result of gunshots instead of bombings. The Xinhua News Agency, China's official news agency, also talked to victims in one hospital in Kabul. One man said the blast was followed by gunshots and his hand was injured as a result. No other armed men except American soldiers were in the area when the shooting took place, he said. Under a rain of bullets, everyone was trying to escape the tragic scene. The account was corroborated by the findings of a BBC journalist by the name of Sigunda Kemani. He posted his report on Twitter later, stressing that many he spoke to, including eyewitnesses, said significant numbers of those killed were shot dead by US forces in the panic after the blast at the airport. Here's one such witness.
Noor Mohammed had been employed alongside American forces.
The guy has served US Army for years, and the reason he lost his life. He wasn't killed by Taliban, he wasn't killed by ISIS. US Army started shelling.
How can you be sure?
Because of the bullet. The bullet went inside of his head, next to, right here, near to his ear.
There were credible first-hand witness accounts of civilians killed by US soldiers in the Kabul airport incident, but such reports were nowhere to be found in US media. There were US journalists on the ground in Afghanistan. Nevertheless, no mention, no stories, no questions asked. Total radio silence. Interestingly, though the BBC report was posted online, the fact that witnesses claimed to have been shot by the US Army did not appear in the headline nor in the description of the video, despite this being a major piece of information in the story. Now, American and British media did report more significantly on the family of 10 that was wiped out, apparently as a result of an errant drone attack in Kabul 3 days after the airport's suicide bombings. But the media did so grudgingly at best, it seems to me. Why do I say that? What happened, first of all, was great tragedy. A car parked in a family home of a densely populated area near the Kabul airport was stricken by a drone strike on Sunday, the 29th of August, instantly killing 10 people, including 6 to 7 children, now the youngest being less than 2-year-old. An unbelievably sad story. But a day later, when I first searched related stories on New York Times website, I found the paper made no mention of the children casualties in its headlines. It was buried deep in a series of updates, which says Afghans said the drone strike killed as many as 9 civilians, including children, and the US military said it was investigating. When I first Googled the key words of Kabul, children, and CNN, I could see a related report on the CNN webpage, but the headline did not mention the children either. Instead, it read, 9 family members killed in US airstrike in Kabul, targeting suspected ISIS-K bomber, relatives says. This was despite the fact that in the very first sentence of that report, the deaths of numerous children were already reported. A day later, when I looked at the CNN website again, it has updated the story and revised the headline into 10 family members, including children, dead after US strike in Kabul. I wonder what made CNN realize it was necessary to put children this time in the headline. A BBC report gave an in-depth description of the situation. In the first paragraph, it did highlight there are civilian casualties involved, including 6 children. But the headline of the story reads, Afghanistan, US investigates civilian deaths in Kabul strike. It seems to have avoided the important message, children died as a result of US military operations. Please care. The headline of a Washington Post article reads, military carries out strike in Kabul as slain service members are returned to US. Nowhere in this headline are the civilian casualties even mentioned, not to mention the children, as if to say some lives matter more than others. The civilian casualties come up briefly in the key points section where there is a bullet point for this information. US airstrike killed civilians, including children, officials and witnesses say. And later, there is reporting dedicated to the tragedy in an updated section under the same headline titled, US acknowledges reports of civilian casualties, but the focus of this report is more on the US military being deeply saddened by any potential loss of innocent life and its confidence in successfully hitting the target rather than the pain caused to the family who lost their loved ones and how such a devastating miscalculation could have even happened in the first place. So, I do acknowledge that these media have subsequently published stories that dive into the tragedy. The BBC even got a family member on air to talk about the tragedy. And I'm not trying to paint these media as being cold-blooded in ignoring human suffering. And there is certainly no Chinese state media campaign on that, as some may claim, seeing such reporting by me, which happened in the past. But I can't help but notice a sense of reluctance to highlight in the same headline the suffering of ordinary Afghans as a result of U.S. operations in the name of fighting terrorism. The Western media were obviously uncomfortable in putting in the same sentence the loss of innocent lives, even that of babies, as a direct result of U.S. war in Afghanistan. Those who may have been shot by U.S. soldiers at the Kabul airport, and young children wiped out together with their family in an instant, and many, many more. All this is particularly jarring when every U.S. life lost there is met with immense grief and attention. Biden said, rightfully, as the U.S. president, to the terrorists, "We will hunt you down." But what if that comes at the cost of tens of thousands of Afghan lives? Did they think about it? Was enough care taken to avoid such losses? Till now, no one has apologized. No one has been held accountable, except the U.S. is investigating. But will we ever know the answers? And the US and UK media, will they press for the answers? We'll take a quick break, and when we return, I'll talk to my guests about the subject. Stay with us. Welcome back to Headline Buster, and I'm pleased to introduce to you our guests who will be participating in the conversation on this topic. They are Ahmad Shah Katawazai, a former senior Afghan diplomat, joining us via Zoom. We have Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, president of the consulting firm Grasshopper Strategies, who's joining us from Philadelphia, the United States, and Professor Jiang Wenran, who is advisor to the Asian program of the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy. He's a retired political science professor at the University of Alberta. He's joining us from Edmonton, Canada. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, very disturbing story and very sad story indeed to me when you read the kind of stories on some US media, on some UK media, where I feel there's a sense of reluctance to report, to link the civilian casualty with the U.S. operations, especially after journalists from China and journalists from the BBC talk to victims of the attacks at the Kabul airport, who speak of being wounded and shot and even killed by gunshots fired by U.S. forces on site. Ahmad, let me go to you. Is that surprising to you? I mean, all of this, this discrepancy in the reporting, and sometimes a lack of focus and a lack of interest sometimes on the civilian cost of the operations.
Well, thank you very much for having us. Regarding the recent event, we see, I'm surprised that after 20 years, still those mistakes are repeated. In 2000, early 2003, 2004, when there were drone strikes, that contributed a lot in the recruitment and increasing the insurgency. Because Afghan people, by culture, they will go for revenge. So they had to take up arms against the US and NATO forces. Why? Because when their houses were struck, their people were killed, innocent civilians were killed. So they had to do that. And night raids were another factor that contributed a lot in this insurgency. So after 20 years, we are repeating the same mistakes, and that's unacceptable and not fair. On the other hand, for the over-the-horizon capability or drone strikes, you need a lot of ground intel and a lot of people which could share with you the precise and correct information. now that the U.S. troops have withdrawn. So where are they getting from this ground intelligence? So that I believe that was the main reason that this strike happened, a wrong intelligence and a wrong attack on wrong time. Unfortunately, the civilians were killed in that. We all know about that. There were members of a single family that were killed. And even I heard that one person was the former interpreter with the U.S. forces,
Yes.
who was killed in this strike.
Yeah, it's very tragic and very ironic as well. Wenran, let me go to you. What was your impression when you watched the news on, for instance, Chinese media, and then when you watch the mainstream media in North America, for instance, and the kind of different focus on what happened in Afghanistan?
Contrast is quite clear. There are intentionally or unintentionally, the Western media are either not reporting the story as much, or it's being reported very in a low-key manner. As you mentioned, of course, the Chinese media, such as your outlet, others pick this up. Unfortunately, it's being not seen as reporting about human life. Many would put this into some kind of a hostile power trying to, demonize the American image or so on and so forth. This is very unfortunate because for those human rights advocates in the Western governments, the collective silence of condemnation or the call for investigation is very saddening. Well, we know things happen. It's a panic withdrawal. There was an attack, was bombing, they panicked, they may have shot at people. They should investigate. Or if they bomb the wrong target, as our Afghan colleague just mentioned, they should investigate and give a good reasoning on what happened to the rest of the world. Now saying they're investigating, they've been doing that for several decades. Whenever there were civilian deaths, there are collateral damage. Unfortunately, this is the very tragic nature of the war. And this actually happened in the last chapter of the US withdrawal. And so therefore, I think people should return to the basics. That is, war is terrible and will not solve problems, and shifting blames and thinking one country's citizens' lives are better or more noble than the others is simply wrong.
Brandon, what is your reaction to all of this? I think Wenran pointed to some of the extreme sad nature of the state of things. First of all, the fact that so many people have lost their lives, right? As I mentioned, over 110,000 civilians lost their lives or wounded in Afghanistan in the past decade alone as a result of the US war in Afghanistan. And then what disturbs me is the fact that when you see these images, when you hear such stories of civilians being killed or even children being killed once, twice, three times, and afterwards you say, well, it's extremely sad, but what can we do? And then this keeps happening, and then after a while you just get a sense of numbness. And to me, that is extremely disturbing.
I agree. It is extremely disturbing. War in all of its forms throughout human history has been exceptionally disturbing. Civilian deaths as part of war is as old as war. There has never been a war that has been confined to the battlefield. There has never been a war that does not include civilian deaths. We're conflating a number of different things here. We are talking about, is the world numb to this? Unfortunately, I think in some places we are. Is US media overwhelmed by the number of scandals and horrible things that they're saying about President Biden and the withdrawal? Absolutely. I see US media talking about the death of children. I see US media talking about the death of US soldiers. I see US media talking about the loss of a government that the world had considered to be the legitimate leadership of a nation. I see them being incredibly critical of pretty much everything that's going on. I also see a US military that is pledging to investigate, as my colleague Wenran is calling for, but we have to give them more than 24 hours to come up with an outcome from that. Particularly when one of the major questions, which we may never know, is going to be, was it the initial drone strike that caused the larger collateral damage, or was it a secondary explosion of hitting a vehicle packed to the gills with bombs? We are talking about what was supposed to be a peaceful withdrawal, a withdrawal that the Taliban themselves have said that they are in favor of, a withdrawal that we've seen reports of the Taliban shepherding people to the exits and saying that this is how it's going to go. We still have elements within Afghanistan launching suicide attacks, launching targets that are in part at U.S. military personnel, but also at the civilians that are looking for evacuation around them. This is abhorrent. It's abhorrent that a drone strike kills civilians. It's also abhorrent that a suicide bomber causes the deaths of civilians.
I
no
get your
one
point.
is more wrong than the other one.
Brandon, I get your point. Of course, a suicide bombing, terrorist attacks must be condemned. They must be hunted down, and terrorist organizations must be wiped out so that they don't inflict damage either on the local people or on anybody else, or on any targets in any faraway places. But again, how to mitigate, how to minimize the civilian casualty, and really take measures to prevent it from happening or minimize it. You know, as I said, 110,000 Afghans wounded and killed in 10 years alone. The number of deaths range from 60,000 Afghans to higher, and you know, there are people talking about 80,000 Pakistanis as well being killed in the U.S. war in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades. I mean, has the civilian casualty been a bit too high compared with whatever you were able to achieve? Ahmad, coming from Kabul, how do you react to the kind of questions that Brandon posed?
So I think the civilian casualties that has been going on from years and years, and unfortunately we do see a huge number of that, and unfortunately that's not stopping. One important factor is that the world don't bring that up to the media, and they don't talk about that when it comes to Afghan people or Afghan civilians. They only talk about troops or foreign soldiers that are killed, and that's unfortunate. That they view the Afghan people from a prism of inferiority, which is not fair at all. For example, in the evacuation, if you see, they are focused only on evacuating around 200,000 people, but Afghanistan is a country of 36 million people. What about them? What will happen to their lives, and who will be accountable for these 36 million people? We do see in the Western media that they are just focused on these 100,000 to 200,000 people. They should be evacuated because they have worked with the Western forces.
Professor Wenran, your comments, and also I really wonder, for instance, you know very clearly that the target that they were going to strike, the United States were going to strike, was in a very densely populated area. If you look at the image, right, it's family compounds where obviously a lot of people were living. It's not some kind of open plain where you have caves when you drop a huge bomb and, you know, try to kill as many terrorists as possible. So in this kind of urban residential area where you carry out a drone strike, shouldn't you be extra careful? Even if you may take out one car loaded with explosives, what about the people who are living immediately around that car? You know, is that consideration not given by the U.S. military?
It is quite important to point out, Brandon mentioned, that ISK terrorist organizations do use civilians as a camouflage hiding spots. That presents extremely challenging options for the military to say, do I press the button to send in the drones knowing the civilians might be killed? If not going to bomb that target, maybe hundreds more might be killed. So now I can understand that difficulty, but I think we do not know on this particular case at this point whether the target, the drone strike, was actually destroyed a full car full of explosives. We don't know that, but the investigation is ongoing. And so there are some plausible cause, as Brandon mentioned, about the complexity. And that would be a typical US media and military explanation. There's some rational explanation behind it. But my question here, other than this particular case, let's talk about the media coverage. What if this is the Russian military or the Chinese who has done this? What would be the global headline news would read like in their behavior on the call for investigation? And the question would be international law, international criminal justice, independent investigation into the killing of the civilians, no matter what is the justification. In this case, my question now is, would the American military subject itself to not only to these kind of incidents, but also the past 20 years of civilian deaths and related potential war crimes in Afghanistan, because the US government made it clear that they're not subject to international law. The Hague-based International Criminal Court cannot and will not allow to prosecute the cases. And that is the situation we're facing today. And therefore, going back to the longer term issues, maybe it's better to learn to not to launch another war. Not only the civilians' death is so high, but also the American soldiers. Biden himself acknowledged 18 US veterans commit suicide every day. That is a human cost, not only to other lives, which obviously is not as expensive as the American ones, but it's there, it is cost.
It's a tragic story on those part as well. I mean, these soldiers, whether they're wounded or killed in Afghanistan or any other overseas battlefield, or whether they commit suicide, I think they're victims as well at the same time. But I think the big moral question have to be asked and the big lesson has to be answered. Ahmad, I'm going to give you the last say because you are, after all, an Afghan. How do you look at all of this? And, do you think the mistake will be learned after 20 years in Afghanistan?
I think this is time for the United States, for NATO allies to learn from their mistakes. After fighting these 20 years where 60,000 of our soldiers died, more than 100,000 civilians, they were either wounded or killed. So what we have achieved, the same people that we were fighting for 20 years, we have handed over them everything in such a disastrous and chaotic way. So there is a lot to be learned why the Afghan National Security Forces, they were dismantled, what happened to the civilian casualties. And this was a foreign policy disaster for the United States and, of course, the NATO allies. So there is a lot to be learned. I think there needs to be a thorough research on this, and we need to learn from our past mistakes.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Many thanks to my three guests, Ahmad Shah Katawazi, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer joining us from the United States, and Professor Jiang Wenran joining us from Canada. Thank you so much for your insights. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.